In July 1918, one of the wealthiest families on the planet walked into a basement in Yekaterinburg. They believed they were posing for a commemorative photograph. They were wrong. Instead, they were facing the brutal liquidation of their entire bloodline. But just hours before this fatal event, Tsar Nicholas II possessed a fortune that rivaled the greatest industrial titans of the West. If you calculate his personal net worth in today's currency, the figure is estimated by some historians to be in the tens of billions of dollars. This was the peak of Imperial Russia finances, a fortune so vast it defied comprehension. Yet, when the smoke in that basement cleared, billions in gold had simply vanished. The key to this disappearance was not held in the state treasury. It was widely rumored to be hidden in foreign accounts, though much of the family's liquid wealth had been spent on the war effort. This is the dark history of the Romanov family wealth, the Russian Revolution, and how one of the most significant fortunes of the modern era turned to dust. But the real reason this empire collapsed was not just a political uprising. It was tied up in complex international accounts and war bonds, though the legend of a single unbreakable trust remains more a subject of conspiracy than documented financial history. We will reveal the truth about that missing gold later. This is the autopsy of the Romanovs. The Romanov dynasty did not begin with silk and diamonds. They began with absolute chaos. In 1613, Russia was a hollowed-out shell. The country was bankrupt, ravaged by famine, and torn apart by internal wars. When Michael Romanov ascended the throne, he did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a pile of debt and a collection of ruined cities. But the Romanovs learned a cold, hard truth early on. Power is not about titles. Power is the absolute control of resources. They did not just rule a nation, they governed an empire spanning a sixth of the Earth's landmass, maintaining a complex distinction between state lands and their vast private estates. By the middle of the 19th century, the scale of their holdings was staggering. While much of this was state property, the family maintained immense personal wealth through the cabinet of His Imperial Majesty. The Tsar held vast personal estates and controlled key industries, though private enterprise and property rights had expanded significantly by the late 19th century. They engineered a system where the line between the national budget and the Tsar's wallet was increasingly regulated, though the family's access to state resources remained unparalleled. If the empire needed funding, it squeezed the peasantry. If the Tsar wanted a new palace, the funding came from the Ministry of the Imperial Court, which managed the family's private income and properties separately from the state treasury. It was the ultimate closed-loop system of capital accumulation. The Romanovs were the original monopolists. They didn't just compete in the market, they exerted immense influence over the market. Though, by the early 20th century, the majority of agricultural land was owned by the peasantry, and a burgeoning class of private industrialists controlled much of the nation's manufacturing. This wasn't just wealth, it was a total financial capture of a civilization. They operated with a level of vertical integration that would make modern tech giants look like amateur startups. Imagine presiding over a nation where the state controlled the strategic infrastructure. The grain exports fueled the economy, and the imperial influence permeated the banking sector. That was the Romanov reality. But as the family's appetite grew, their ability to manage this gargantuan enterprise began to fail. They were treating a 20th century world like a medieval fiefdom. They were billion-dollar CEOs who refused to look at the factory floor. They were surrounded by gold, but they were breathing the air of a dying system. The foundation of their greed was solid gold, but the soil beneath it was turning into a swamp of resentment. They believed their wealth was divine. They believed it was permanent. They were wrong on both counts. Because while they were busy counting their billions, a new force was rising that didn't care about their gold. A force that realized that if you kill the owner, the assets are up for grabs. The Romanovs presided over one of the world's largest state-controlled economies, but they forgot to lock the front door. And the people who were about to walk through that door weren't looking for a loan, They were looking for everything. The Romanovs had spent 300 years building a fortress of capital, but they were about to find out that when the market crashes, it doesn't matter how much gold you have in the basement if you've lost the trust of the street. They had turned Russia into a family business, but the shareholders were finally ready for a hostile takeover. And in the world of high-stakes empire building, there are no golden parachutes. There is only the end. But before the end, there was the peak. A period of spending so detached from reality, it borders on the insane. To understand the fall, you have to understand the height of the monopoly they built. A monopoly that wasn't just on land or gold, but a monopoly on God himself. Nicholas II did not just rule a country. He managed a vertical monopoly that would make modern Silicon Valley titans look like street vendors. To understand his wealth, you have to stop thinking of Russia as a nation and start seeing it as a private family estate. His annual income was 24 million gold rubles. In today's purchasing power, that is a clean $500 million of liquid profit every single year. This was not a salary. This was a dividend from the largest corporation on the planet. The Romanov family were the ultimate landlords. They owned over 150 million acres of land. That is a territory larger than the state of Texas and the country of France combined. But they didn't just own the dirt. They owned everything beneath it. Every gold vein in the Ural Mountains, every diamond deposit in the Siberian tundra, and every drop of oil in the Caucasus was effectively their personal property. If a foreign company wanted to mine Russian minerals, they didn't just pay a tax, they paid the Tsar. Their business model was built on a terrifyingly efficient concept: the divine right of the CEO. Nicholas was not just the head of state, he was the earthly representative of God. This gave him a psychological monopoly. To question his spending was not just treason, it was heresy. When the Tsar decided to expand his portfolio, he didn't need a board of directors. He simply signed a decree. Consider the grain trade. At the turn of the 20th century, Russia was the breadbasket of Europe. The Romanovs controlled the infrastructure that moved this grain. They owned the railways, they owned the ports, they owned the very soil the wheat grew in. This was a closed-loop system of capital accumulation. Every time a loaf of bread was eaten in London or Berlin, a fraction of a cent eventually found its way into a Romanov vault. But their most impressive asset was the Imperial Gold Reserve. By 1914, the Russian Empire held the largest hoard of gold on the face of the earth. Over 1,200 tons of pure bullion. It was stored in the fortified basements of the Winter Palace and the State Bank. This gold was the anchor of the ruble, making it one of the most stable and respected currencies in the global market. At that moment, the Romanov brand was the ultimate, quote, zero investment. The Tsar's personal liquidity was so vast that he acted as a global lender. He wasn't just hoarding cash, he was buying influence. The family held massive stakes in French banks, British shipping lines, and German industry. They were the ultimate old money power players, weaving a web of financial dependency across the entire European continent. They were too big to fail, or so they thought. While the rest of the world was moving toward industrial capitalism and democratic oversight, Nicholas was doubling down on a 17th century feudal business model. He ran a 20th century superpower like a medieval manor. He was a man who viewed the national treasury as his personal checking account. If the Empress wanted a new palace in Crimea, the money was moved. If the Grand Dukes wanted to spend a summer gambling in Monte Carlo, the ruble flowed. This was a monopoly on everything: land, faith, resources, and law. It was a financial fortress built on the backs of 150 million employees who had no unions, no shares, and no say in the company's direction. The Romanovs were sitting on a mountain of gold, completely blind to the fact that the mountain was actually a dormant volcano. But wealth of this magnitude creates a specific kind of sensory deprivation. When you own 1/6 of the earth, you lose the ability to perceive risk. Nicholas believed his bank account was protected by God himself. He didn't realize that in the world of high-stakes finance, a monopoly is only as strong as the force used to protect it. And while his vaults were filling up, the social contract was being torn to pieces. The family was about to learn a brutal lesson in market correction. The Romanov lifestyle was not just an expression of wealth, it was an exercise in the absolute absurd. While the average worker in St. Petersburg survived on black bread and hope, the imperial family existed in a vacuum of sheer physical impossibility. They didn't just spend money, they weaponized it to insulate themselves from the gravity of the real world. To understand the scale, you have to look at their surroundings. The Alexander Palace wasn't a home. It was a sprawling machine of luxury. They lived surrounded by walls of silk and floors of rare Siberian woods. But the true signature of Romanov decadence was the House of Fabergé. These were not mere trinkets. Each imperial Easter egg was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering and jewelry that cost as much as a modern private jet. One single egg, the winter egg of 1913, was carved from rock crystal as thin as glass and studded with over 4,000 diamonds. It was a gift that symbolized a family so wealthy they could afford to freeze time itself in precious stones. Empress Alexandra lived in a state of perpetual aesthetic obsession. Her coronation dress alone was a financial monument. It was heavy with silver thread and encrusted with thousands of hand-stitched pearls. Experts estimate the value of that single garment in today's market at over $10 million. She didn't just wear clothes. She wore the equivalent of a skyscraper. But their stationary palaces were only part of the story. The Romanovs believed that even when they moved, the world should bend to their comfort. Enter the Standard. This wasn't a yacht, it was a floating palace of 5,000 tons. It was the largest and most expensive private vessel on the planet. The interiors were finished in mahogany and crystal. It featured a brass band, a massive chapel, and even a stable for a cow so the children could have fresh milk while at sea. Hundreds of sailors were stationed on board, not to navigate, but to ensure the emperor's tea was served at exactly 72 degrees Celsius. The annual maintenance of this single boat cost more than the budgets of entire Russian cities. When they traveled by land, they used the imperial train. It was a series of blue and gold carriages that functioned as a mobile fortress. Each car was interconnected by heated, carpeted gangways. The dining car was a miracle of velvet and silver, where 10-course meals were served while the train sped through provinces where famine was a seasonal reality. They lived in a continuous loop of consumption, for the sake of consumption. The family's jewelry collection was so vast, it required its own bureaucracy. The Russian crown jewels were a mountain of heavy gold, massive emeralds, and the Orlov diamond, a stone so large it looked like a piece of candy. Nicholas and Alexandra viewed these items not as state property, but as family heirlooms. They treated the national treasury like a personal ATM with an infinite balance. They never saw a price tag. They never carried cash. They had reached a level of wealth where the concept of a cost had become an abstract theory, something that only applied to lesser people. This was the peak of the gilded life, a world of white tie balls where the floor was covered in rose petals and the champagne flowed in literal rivers. They were the ultimate influencers of the 20th century, setting a standard of luxury that no billionaire today could ever hope to replicate. They had achieved total victory over scarcity. But in their quest to build a paradise of gold and silk, they had forgotten the most basic rule of architecture. A house built on top of a volcano doesn't care how expensive the wallpaper is. The Romanovs were so distracted by the sparkle of their diamonds that they didn't notice the floor beneath them was starting to heat up. The gold was piled high, the wine was cold, and the music was playing. But the bill for 300 years of excess was finally being printed. And the currency required to pay it wouldn't be rubles, it would be blood. While the Tsar was obsessing over the luster of his pearls, his empire was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own shadows. World War I was the worst investment in the history of the Romanov dynasty. It was the moment Nicholas II took the family business and bet it all on a losing hand. He didn't just spend the empire's gold, he liquidated the very concept of the monarchy. By 1914, the Russian Empire was a financial titan on paper, but its liquidity was a mirage. The war effort was a black hole. It demanded 50 million rubles every single day. To put that into perspective, the Tsar was burning through the equivalent of $1 billion of modern purchasing power every 24 hours. The Romanovs treated the national treasury like a personal credit card with no limit. But the limit existed. It was called reality. As the front lines collapsed, so did the ruble. Nicholas made the fatal mistake of printing money to cover his losses. Inflation didn't just rise, it exploded. The price of bread in Petrograd skyrocketed by 500%. While the Romanov daughters were still wearing dresses woven with silver thread, the average Russian worker couldn't afford a sack of grain. The optics weren't just bad, they were a death sentence for the brand. Inside the palaces, the air was thick with paranoia and betrayal. The Romanov family tree began to splinter. The Grand Dukes, the Tsar's own cousins and uncles, were the first to smell the smoke. They were the ultimate insiders. They knew the books were cooked. While Nicholas was playing soldier at the front, the elite members of the family began a massive, silent liquidation of their assets. This was the first great capital flight of the 20th century. They weren't just moving furniture, they were smuggling the wealth of a nation out in diplomatic pouches. They sold their estates at fire sale prices. They converted land into diamonds and moved those diamonds to Paris, London, and New York. They used their royal status to bypass customs, sending crates of gold and jewelry to foreign banks. They were hedging against their own bloodline. The Grand Dukes were buying apartments in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, while the Tsar was still convinced the peasants loved him. It was a hostile takeover from within. The family was cannibalizing itself before the revolution even started. Meanwhile, the Tsar's reputation among international investors was in freefall. London and Wall Street looked at Russia and saw a sinking ship. The Romanov name, once the most stable __quote _4 rating in the world, was now junk status. Nicholas tried to borrow more. He tried to leverage the empire's future, but the world was moving on. The industrial age had no room for a divine right monarch who couldn't balance a ledger. By the time 1917 arrived, the Tsar wasn't just politically isolated, he was bankrupt. He had lost the support of the one group that mattered more than the peasants, the creditors. When the bread riot started, Nicholas didn't have the cash to buy loyalty. The army didn't defect because of ideology, they defected because their boots were rotting and their paychecks were worthless paper. The Romanovs had spent 3 centuries accumulating the world's greatest fortune, only to find that in the end, you cannot eat gold and you cannot shoot diamonds. The foundation hadn't just cracked, it had turned to dust. The family was about to learn that when the bank of public trust goes bust, the liquidation process is a bloodbath. The Tsar was no longer a ruler, he was a liability. And in the world of high-stakes power, liabilities are always removed from the balance sheet. But as the Romanovs were moved from palace to prison, they carried a secret that would lead to a final, desperate attempt to buy their way out of the grave. This was the beginning of the end, but the real mystery was just starting to unfold in the vaults of the Bank of England. The mechanics of the fall were as swift as they were surgical. Once Nicholas signed the abdication papers on a cold train platform, the Romanov brand died instantly. But the financial death was far more complex. Within hours, the provisional government froze every domestic account linked to the imperial family. The Romanovs were now prisoners in their own palaces, surrounded by billions in assets they could no longer touch. But there was one final insurance policy: the secret fund in London. For years, rumors swirled about a massive deposit made by Nicholas II into the Bank of England. This was the open loop that kept the family's hopes alive during their internal exile. It was whispered that the Tsar had moved several £1,000,000 sterling into a private account intended to serve as a dowry for his 4 daughters. In today's valuation, we are talking about a multi-billion-dollar safety net sitting in the heart of the British financial district. It was meant to be their escape hatch, their ticket to a quiet life in the English countryside. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, the situation shifted from a political crisis to a total asset liquidation. The new regime didn't just want the throne, they wanted the ledger. They began a process of nationalization that remains the largest seizure of private property in human history. They took the palaces, they took the factories, they took the land, but they couldn't find the liquid cash. The Romanovs, sensing the end, began a desperate game of financial camouflage. They didn't use banks, they used their clothes. The Grand Duchesses and the Empress Alexandra spent weeks sewing high-grade diamonds, massive emeralds, and strings of pearls into the linings of their corsets and hats. They were literally wearing a billion-dollar portfolio. This wasn't jewelry anymore. It was a portable currency designed to bribe guards or buy a passage to freedom. But wealth without power is just a target. On that final night in July 1918, the diamonds became a physical curse. When the firing squad opened fire in the basement of the Ipatiev house, something miraculous and horrific happened. The bullets bounced off the children. The thick layer of sewn-in gemstones acted as a makeshift, albeit ineffective, bulletproof vest. The wealth they had spent their lives accumulating didn't save them. It only prolonged their final moments, turning a quick execution into a chaotic struggle. Once the smoke cleared, the question of the Romanov billions shifted to the international stage. The Soviet government wanted the money to fund their revolution. The surviving relatives wanted the money to maintain their status in exile. But the British Crown and the Bank of England played a much colder game. When the dust settled, the British government conveniently claimed that the records of the Tsar's private accounts were unclear, despite documented evidence of massive transfers made during the war to support the Allied effort and private family trusts. The gold and the cash seemingly evaporated into the British ledger. The British royal family, cousins to the Romanovs, refused to grant them asylum, and the British banks refused to release the funds to the surviving claimants. The open loop of the London millions was closed not with a payout, but with a wall of silence. The money wasn't lost, it was absorbed. The British financial system essentially received a massive, interest-free injection of capital that was never returned to its rightful heirs. The Romanovs had learned the ultimate lesson of the banking world. If you owe the bank 1,000 rubles, it is your problem. If you give the bank £100 million and then your entire bloodline is erased, it becomes the bank's profit. The greatest private fortune in the history of the world was gone. Not because it was spent, but because the institutions that were supposed to guard it realized there was no one left powerful enough to demand it back. The Romanovs were no longer clients. They were a closed account. But even with the family gone and the accounts frozen, the physical ghost of their wealth began a new, strange journey across the globe. Today, the Romanov legacy is a ghost haunting the world's most elite auction houses. When a Fabergé egg appearing at Sotheby's fetches $15 million, we aren't just looking at art, we are looking at the shrapnel of a shattered financial supernova. The palaces that once served as the private offices of the world's wealthiest man have been converted into state-run museums. The very government that systematically erased the family now charges tourists $30 a head to walk through their bedrooms. It is the ultimate irony of history. The Bolsheviks didn't just seize the assets. They turned the Romanov lifestyle into a permanent revenue stream for the state. But where did the actual liquid wealth go? The mystery of the Romanov billions remains the greatest cold case in financial history. For decades, treasure hunters have obsessed over the legend of Kolchak's gold. They scour the Siberian wilderness for hidden train cars filled with imperial bullion. They dive into the depths of Lake Baikal, hoping to find the 500 tons of gold that allegedly vanished during the White Army's retreat. Others focus on the town of Tobolsk, convinced that the family buried a king's ransom in the frozen soil before their final journey to Yekaterinburg. The reality, however, is much colder and far more surgical. Most of the wealth didn't vanish into the woods. It was absorbed by the very institutions that promised to protect it. When Nicholas II moved his capital into the Bank of England, he believed he was buying an insurance policy for his 4 daughters. He thought a British cousin and a prestigious London vault were safer than a Russian fortress. He was wrong. In the world of high finance, there is no such thing as friendship, only the cold calculation of unclaimed assets. By refusing to recognize the claims of surviving relatives, the British financial system effectively executed a quiet, bloodless seizure of one of the largest private accounts in human history. The Romanovs were the ultimate victims of their own design. They created a system where wealth was entirely concentrated in a single bloodline. There were no boards of directors to check the Tsar's spending. There were no independent auditors to verify the imperial accounts. There was only the family. When that bloodline was severed in a basement in 1918, the legal title to that wealth became a void. The money didn't just change hands, it lost its identity. It became __quote_6___. And in the banking world, stateless capital is eventually consumed by the house. This was the autopsy of an empire. The Romanovs didn't lose their money because they were poor managers. They lost it because they forgot the fundamental rule of power. Wealth is only as strong as the society that agrees it belongs to you. They treated a nation of 150 million people as a private subsidiary. They ignored the rising costs of human suffering while decorating their gowns with $10 million worth of pearls. They built a financial fortress with no exits, and when the fire started, they were trapped inside with all their gold. The $300 billion fortune of Nicholas II didn't buy him a private army when he needed it most. It didn't buy him a fast ship to London. It only bought him a target on his back. Today, the Romanov name is a brand used to sell luxury watches and historical dramas. The gold is gone, the land is redistributed, and the secret bank accounts have been folded into the bottom lines of global financial giants. The greatest accumulation of private wealth in the history of our species ended with a balance of 0. Money is not just a tool for opportunity, it is a beacon for gravity. The Romanovs are the ultimate warning that wealth without a social contract is nothing more than a very expensive trap. They were the richest people to ever walk the earth, yet they couldn't purchase a single extra second of life when the clock ran out. If you want to understand how modern empires are making the exact same mistakes with their billions today, hit the subscribe button. History doesn't repeat itself, but the price of hubris never changes.